Yeah, but I want to read a question that's coming on our Twitter line. Um, Randall writes, who defines North America, and did that definition change after NAFTA, and is North America geolocated in media itself? It's a more complicated
Geolocated in the
question than it
what?
seems. Is is uh, is it geolocated in media?
Ah, interesting. Yeah, well, let me have two quick responses to that. I think in some ways, North America existed before the Mexican-American War of 1848. There was a North America that was very Hispanic that extended into central Texas, into New Mexico, into California, to some degree into Florida, although that had already been pretty much taken over. But to some degree, we created an Anglophone overlay to what was already, in some ways, it became a transnational space when we imposed our original borders because the people who were there from Mexico didn't go anywhere. And to some degree, I think it's now created as a media space, has been. I remember doing a content analysis oriented TV flow study a few years ago, in fact, back in the early 90s, where I said in some ways, North America has three countries with five distinct media markets. You have Anglo-US, Hispanic US, Anglo-Canada, French Canada, and Mexico. So in some ways, you can look at huge, huge, powerful media markets that have been kind of destabilizing the nations of North America, both from without and from within, for a long time now. At least as long as we've had broadcasting going across borders from Mexico to the United States, from the United States into Canada. So I think in some ways, NAFTA just recognized in media terms something that had already been going on, that we had these huge flows that really powerfully affected markets somewhat defined by language and culture, but very much defined by flow of people and media as well.
I'll just say something very brief in response to that. I mean, the concept of who is an American is definitely very debated. And in Latin America, and particularly in Cuba, they often feel that the United States took over America and that it's the Americas, and they have a very important cultural institution in Havana called Casa de las Americas, the house or the home of the Americas, and the idea is that a Cuban is an American, a Brazilian is an American, that the Americas really spans the whole continent. So there's definitely a strong political feeling about that. You find that very, very much in Latin America, the sense that the U.S. has appropriated America for itself. So, but I'm sure that probably has nothing to do with how the media operates.
Well, maybe it's a good time to just thank our panelists. And Joe, thank you from Portugal.
Sure. Actually, if I could say one last thing before stopping, something else Oswin mentioned that I really wanted to get into. I remember your original call for papers. I thought very much about doing an entirely different presentation, very much focused on the whole question of area studies, because I guess I find myself in a contradictory space. I recognize all the problems with area studies, but the thing that I find continuingly valuable about it, while I still do both Brazilian area studies and Latin America, is that in some ways it creates an interdisciplinarity in the academy that's otherwise rather hard to find. So the continuing value I find, I want to complexify area studies enormously, but it continues to have a really important place in my work, simply because it's the place where I get to talk to anthropologists, historians, and other people, which when we shift to a more global focus, I don't always get such direct interaction with.
Joe, can you hear this?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I was also going to ask you if you could say very briefly the other work you've been doing, thinking about area studies, but more from a sort of building on the Black Atlantic sort of idea, where you've been talking about the Lusophone cultural sphere as one way to think about an area studies paradigm. So
That's true.
I know it'll take a long time to talk about it, but maybe a quick 2-minute thing on your Lusophone cultural sphere project.
Sure. Yeah, because in fact I've got two related projects. One is kind of looking at the Lusophone cultural sphere. I'm working with people in Portugal and Brazil and Mozambique, particularly, to look at kind of the transnational spaces defined by language and culture and not by geography. So I think in some ways the Anglophone sphere, which we seldom think about, that in many ways the United States is implicated within media very powerfully by its greater attraction to English-speaking countries, either the settler countries of, like, say, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Canada, but in some ways also a greater access at a less tangible level to places that simply speak English but are quite culturally different, including India. So I think in some ways we don't realize how much more open we are to the culture of other Anglophone countries in a way that privileges a post-colonial relationship for the United States that we don't always think about, our Anglophoneness as a transnational phenomenon. And so the other project is actually comparing Lusophone and Anglophone at some point.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you all speakers, and we'll take a 5-minute break and
All right,
begin
thank you
our
all.
last panel.
And